This is Say It Loud. Buckle your seatbelts and get ready to immerse yourself in the complexities of our government. In 3, 2, 1, blast off.
Hello, welcome to the first episode of our podcast. Today we will be talking about religious freedom and how it's evolved throughout American history. My name is Maria.
My name is Arif.
My name's Archit.
My name is Leica.
And my name's Danush, and I'll be the moderator for this discussion.
So first, I think it'd be good if we start off with a little context about how religious liberty started and evolved throughout American history.
Yeah, I think for this we can go back to the founding of the colonies, in which you have people fleeing England because of religious persecution. And when they came to America, they wanted to form communities that allowed them to practice their, for example, like the Puritans' religion freely. However, this meant that while they wanted religious freedom for themselves, they often prohibited that for other people, often enforcing strict rules and regulations, which led to people forming new colonies, for example, Rhode Island.
Yeah, and you can see this tension, especially, for example, in Maryland, where they had to pass the Maryland Toleration Act because Maryland was a primarily Catholic colony, but they did have Protestant colonists in as well, and they were constantly in tension. By passing this act, they aimed to balance these different types of religion as well and the tensions they created.
And as we move towards the founding of our Constitution itself, religious freedom and religious toleration became even more of an issue, particularly because it started to become about the freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. And as we create our Constitution, the First Amendment which is the First Amendment that protects speech, press, association, petition, and now for the religious clauses, the free exercise clause, which states that individuals can exercise their religious activities, and the Establishment Clause, which says that the government cannot force citizens or individuals to follow a specific religion. So the right to religion is explicitly protected in the Constitution as we know it today.
Exactly, and I think that something that's interesting to note, and adding on to this changing attitudes towards religious freedom, is when you look at the drafting of the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, which is known as one of the first documents that really put into words religious freedom. James Madison actually changed the wording from religious tolerance to religious liberty, and I believe that was a small but really impactful change that kind of cemented the importance of having not just respecting other people's religions, but allowing them to exercise it to the fullest extent.
All right, so we're here to discuss, again, I just want to bring this up, how do you think recent court cases have affected religious freedoms? Do you guys have any examples, anything you'd like to add?
I think the primary example which we can look to is the 2022 Supreme Court case Kennedy v. Bremerton, where we saw a marking lowering of the wall of separation as coined by Thomas Jefferson, because in this case, an after-hours private coach-led prayer was deemed constitutional because it was voluntary, and supposedly the players were not pressured into performing this prayer. However, there have been concerns raised regarding how voluntary this was due to the pressure of the situation and due to the authority role of the coach.
I think the biggest issue was that the court really misconstrued the facts of the case itself. The court says that the coach was doing a private prayer on his own, but the truth was that he was doing a very public prayer at the middle of the football field, where not only were players joining him, but also fans were joining him. So there was a level of pressure that players had to follow their coach and follow their peers in continuing this, in participating in this prayer, even though they may not be Christian like the coach was.
And I think what's even more problematic is what this decision means going forward, especially in the decision the justices talk about this idea of looking at history and traditions. And so this history and traditions test, as it's called, essentially looks at past precedent for religious practices to determine if it really is a violation of the Establishment Clause. And this can be especially problematic given that America's past has often been dominated by Judeo-Christian ideas. And so if we begin to accept those practices as, for example, cultural and secular or non-secular, then that becomes a problem for religious freedom going forward.
Yeah, and one of the ways we kind of see this Christian preference play out in the Bremerton case is that when the coach first started his prayers, these were in the locker rooms. They were actually small and private. But then they kind of became a tradition at the school, and maybe the people thought they brought good luck, and slowly over time it became the big thing that led to the case. Yet it is because that these like prayers, which are mainly Christian majority, have been entwined in kind of the traditions and culture of the school that we led to such a big issue. Never once do we see prayers of different religions at the school, which is one of the current concerns that was brought up as well.
Yeah, like I don't know about you, but I feel like if the coach was not Christian, it was a different, maybe minority of religion fate, like the case would not have played out the same way. Like I can probably confidently say that.
Adding on to Leica's point, these Judeo-Christian values are so intertwined with our history and the foundations of our nation. We can see these with the mottos on our currency, in God we trust, or in the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. And I think that's an important point to note in regards to religious freedom.
Right, but the question I think has become is like, are these statements that, like, correct, for example, one nation under God, correct, sorry, is that how like a secular purpose itself? Like, yes, it might be promoting God, but like the purpose or the context of it now is not very secular, so is it still a violation of the Establishment Clause in your opinion, or no?
I believe we can look back to why they brought it in to begin with, at least for one nation under God. This was in the context of the Cold War, where the United States needed to distance themselves from the secular, non-religious Soviet Union. And therefore, I guess in a way it would stand as a symbol of distancing and creating an American identity, but regardless, it still does have a religious connotation, which can violate the establishment.
Right, but then the question becomes like, does anything that has a religious connotation not allowed by the government? For example, if they use the word sin is a word that has a religious connotation to the Christian religion, can the government not use the word sin now because it has a religious connotation?
I think that is definitely a hard gray area that we still grapple with today. But I think when I was reading about a case, Lynch v. Donnelly, 1984, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, she proposed this what that was a reasonable informed observer, what would they think, for example, one nation under God. And so that kind of puts what is the perceived association or connotation with something like the government endorsing something like that.
Yeah, but a reasonable observer in the context, an American person, is someone that has been subjected to the influence of this religious imagery throughout their life. If you, for example, to take someone from Asia, where Christian religions are not very heavily prominent, they may come to America and suddenly see all this Christian imagery over the place. And I get at the point that Arv is going at. Sin in the context of which he mentioned government use is that of literary kind of an colloquial context, whereas, for example, the literary study of the Bible is allowed in class and does not violate the Establishment Clause because it's not promoting religion in any way, which I believe kind of Sandra O'Day Connor was kind of getting at in that test.
I will say, okay, when you talk about intention, that reminds me of our favorite Lemon test, which is obviously had a lot of issues, but I think one thing that it did do well was kind of really thinking about one, what is the perceived action, and does it promote or inhibit religion, and then does it have a secular purpose or not. So I think it looks in more detail exactly what's the action happening here, and to determine whether there's a violation of the Establishment Clause, which I would say is more thorough.
I think the question of what is considered promoting religion is actually a very interesting question that we still deal with today.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I believe there should be a complete wall of separation between religion and government. That's to say the government should not be even talking about any religion at all, because it might be unknowingly promoting some religions over the others. For example, forget the case. Zeldin v. Simmons Harris 2003, the Supreme Court ruled that vouchers for students could be used. The government had to give vouchers to students to go to private schools, but most of the private schools were Christian, so at the end of the day, they were actually promoting Christianity. So I believe that there should be instead a full wall of separation between government and religion, so that there can be no unknowing support of some specific religions.
Well, if you want a complete wall of separation, I have kind of scenario for you to think about. Because in Wallace Tax Commission v. New York, the court stated that exempting churches from paying taxes did not violate the Establishment Clause, and in fact raised the wall of separation because there was no longer the exchange of money between church and the government because the churches didn't have to pay taxes to the government. So do you think like that kind of caveat, which is they're interacting with churches, but raising the wall of separation in a sense is okay?
I don't think that's like breaking the wall of separation or stopping the wall of separation, because at the end of the day, government's like still treating the church as if they're a regular institution. That's to say that the government is not supporting a specific religion or a church for no apparent reason. I think that this is actually a continuation of the wall of separation instead of breaking the wall of separation.
I think also you have to be careful when you get into like this idea of like classification as well, of like, you know, like what is like a religious institution, and like I feel like, I don't know, that might be like exploited in some way in the future, or like possibly. But yeah, I think, you know, the more the government like tries to not discriminate, but like, you know, make like differences between different institutions, you might have a problem.
Let's move on. I'd like to move away from the Establishment Clause and let's move more towards the Free Exercise Clause. Are there any cases or any events that have happened relating to this?
Yeah, I think one that, you know, has been talked about widely, like in the media, is the case of Masterpiece Cake Shop v. Colorado Commission. It's not necessarily like directly relating to free exercise, but I think it poses like an interesting thing, like an implication for that. In the case, there was a pretty religious, like conservative baker, and there's a gay couple that wanted a cake for their wedding, and the baker refused to bake that cake for them because they believed that it went against their religious views. And at the end of the day, the Colorado Commission did not practice. They were like basically like it was. They showed like hostility towards the Christian baker. So then the Supreme Court ruled that they couldn't like enforce anti-discrimination laws. So at the end of the day, like the Supreme Court didn't really address the issue of free exercise, but I think we can still discuss like, you know, what it stands for.
Right. But the Supreme Court later clarified their stance on this issue in 303 Creative v. Elenius 2023. In this case, there was a website designer who was supposed to be making websites for new weddings, but a gay couple asked this website designer to make a website for their wedding, and a website designer refused to do so, citing their free exercise clause. And the court ruled that this was allowable, that this was not discrimination towards the gay couple, and that this was part of the website designer's free exercise clause.
Part of the court's reasoning and supporters of the decision, what they'd like to cite is that the scenarios are different for normal discrimination and the so-called discrimination in this case. Whereas for a public accommodation, such as a donut shop, this does not require any personal thought or art that goes into it. It's a financial transaction for a donut, and then the person moves on. Whereas for designing a cake or designing a website, there has to be art and thought and personal freedom that goes into it. And in that case, for making a cake, then it's like forcing someone to do art. So there's some ethical implications for that.
I think like the distinction between like public and private is good and like helpful in like navigating this, but then like when we get into like art and like the process of like making these things, I think it gets a little complicated because art is like so subjective.
But I think like the more clearer issue is that like I don't agree with either rulings, but I think that's because it just sets dangerous precedent. It's kind of difficult to decide what can be considered part of your free exercise rights and what can't be considered part of your free exercise rights. So I think instead we should just focus on like anti-discrimination laws as a whole, because it sets dangerous precedent for like other future cases where there is like blatant discrimination under the pretense of religious or free exercise.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Aram, and not only does it this kind of constant balancing act between one's personal rights and kind of the rest of the public and how they can enjoy the world, and affects one person's life. But we also see it in other places, such as especially the workplace environment. How far do employers need to go to be able to accommodate workplaces, especially if they're public employers or private employers? In the recent case, Groff v. DeJoy, Groff was a USPS worker, so part of a national service that was religious and requested Sundays off because of their religion was not accommodated. Yet the court found that USPS had to accommodate DeJoy unless it placed an undue burden on the company, which in the case of a federal institution, there was no one person taking a Sunday off would not place an undue burden. So he was offered that. But then how does that affect the people around him? His coworkers will have to cover for him because he can't work on Sunday and things like that. So it's just a constant balancing act of how much leeway should we give to the importance of free exercise.
Yeah, and I think in talking about employment, I feel like we should bring up one case. It's really important. Employment Division v. Smith, 1990, and in that case, they said that it was okay to fire the workers. That them banning peyote was not an issue, even though it hindered their ability to practice in their religious practices. So, and then in response to that, you have RFRA, which is protecting religious freedoms, and so. What do you think about from that perspective as well about targeting minority religions through legislation like this?
Well, I'd like to go back to Employment Division first, and I think that one thing the Employment Division handled wrong was that the way that they analyzed the importance of religious freedom, where instead of using a more strict scrutiny basis for laws that infringe on religious freedom, they used a more rational basis, that the government did not have to prove that there was a compelling interest in things like that. If we look to the next case, Church of Lukemi Babalu I, the court ruled that a law banning animal sacrifice, when it did not ban things at meat houses slaughtering animals, was not generally applicable, and this was evaluated under a strict scrutiny stance. Where if Church of Lukemi Babalu I was evaluated under the Employment Division rational basis, there's no way the law would have been repealed. And I think such an important right like the First Amendment, that First Amendment's freedom of religion should be constantly evaluated under strict scrutiny, and that's kind of what RFRA requires the courts to do.
But I kind of disagree with you, Maria. I think if you look at Employment Division v. Smith 1990, in a vacuum, then I think the court does everything right. Peyote is a hallucinogen, and it should not be allowed. It causes intense hallucinations.
Yeah.
Intense hallucinations, and I think the law was pretty generally applicable. It banned peyote for everyone. It didn't just say it's only banned for this native tribe. It's banned for everyone. So if you look at it in a vacuum, I don't think the Employment Division v. Smith decision was inherently wrong. But if you look at the context around it and how other alcohol drinking wine during church was not considered illegal, I think if you look at the circumstances around the decision, it is a wrong decision.
But in that case, I feel like alcohol and hallucinogens are very different, because alcohol, even in small quantities versus hallucinogens in small quantities, there's a very different psychological impact on the brain. And I think the court may have chose the right decision in that case by classifying these two drugs differently.
I think Marie talked about RFRAs and how the court should look to them more. But also I think it can be problematic. Looking at the case Hobby Lobby in 2014, that was kind of the reasoning that was used to give corporations, essentially, give them that freedom of religion power, which can be really dangerous. Because that's not just affecting the owners, but also all of their employers. And yes, I guess you could say you have a choice to work, in such a place that has such beliefs. But I think it represents something bigger about giving these non-human entities this power.
I think the controversy around Hobby Lobby is not necessarily that RFRA was used to support the decision, but the facts of the case itself, where Hobby Lobby refused to provide employee with access to abortion drugs because of their religious beliefs. I think that it's important to acknowledge that perhaps if Hobby Lobby was more about a socially acceptable kind of topic, that the society would not have shifted its view on RFRA, where initially RFRA was more celebrated among the population, which could be because a majority of the population is religious. But RFRA today, even if it's not adopted, RFRA today is adopted by many states, so it's not necessarily could have been controlled as an expansion of power.
Right, and one last question before we end this podcast is there's state RFRAs and there's national RFRAs, and which one do you think is better? Or on a broader sense, do you think the national government should do a job of protecting religious liberty, or should that be left to the states themselves? What do you guys think?
I think while I would be like a proponent of like, giving states more power because they can better meet the needs of their population, I think that can also be a problem, especially when states have large like religious groups. For example, like Utah has like a large Mormon population, and that poses a greater danger to the minority faiths in that state because those state governments and legislatures, which are probably represented by people of that faith, are more likely to pass legislation that gives them like more religious freedom at the expense of possibly minority faiths.
I agree with Leica, and we also see that with the modern issue of one of the southern states, Tennessee or Oklahoma. They wanted to pass, or Louisiana, wanted to pass the 10 Commandments and put them mandatorily in schools. And that's not really a religious protection. I believe that's a violation of the Establishment Clause. But since the majority is Christian, they believe that it's acceptable. And I feel like a national government can avoid such problems.
It's more objective.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, like, first of all, on like a theoretical level, it should be the states that are handling kind of religious protections. If we look to like Brutus I, the main argument for states was because the states are more in tune with the people, they're able to more accurately protect people's rights instead of a large national government can kind of just assumes everyone is a huge conglomerate. In the case of religious freedoms, where it's a right that is deeply personal, the states are able to better understand it. But then on a practical level, we do see like all these like kind of issues that are coming about when states are in control. But also the national government practically implementing this would also pose a bigger threat, especially as like our politicians are Christian, as their voter bases are Christian too. We see in the recent election of Donald Trump, evangelicals played a huge role in his victory, and that's since the national government with so much power, more power than state governments, would potentially pose a bigger threat.
Okay, so to recap, while we're not done, there's a lot of things we talked about still. To recap, on this episode we talked about, the history of religious freedom in America and how important that notion has been, both in like founding and helping us get to where we are today, as well as the different clauses of freedom of religion in the First Amendment and how they have affected religious freedoms in society today, and they're both like in the court and through legislation and in society as well. And I think like discussing all of this is especially important moving forward, with both like a changing political and social landscape, and like religion, like whether we like it or not, is like always going to be important. And so I think the best way is to keep having these discussions, keep changing how we like interact with it and like what role we want it to play in our daily lives. And so yeah, I think, yeah, you can cut that out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. That was Say It Loud with Arav, Maria, Leka, Arkith, and Danush.